1977 Wessex Studios, London. The corridor was narrow and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and generational warfare. In one room, Queen was crafting their next masterpiece with the precision of Swiss watchmakers. In the adjacent studio, the Sex Pistols were recording chaos with the subtlety of a brick through a window. When Sid Vicious burst through Queen's studio door, without knocking, chest puffed, safety pins glinting, sneer firmly in place, he expected to intimidate the dinosaur rock stars. What he got instead was Freddie Mercury rising from his piano bench with the quiet authority of someone who'd fought harder battles than this posturing child could imagine. "Demek Monsieur Freddie Mercury Sensen," Sid snarled, his voice dripping with contempt designed to wound. "Still doing those ballet moves, Fred? Or are you too tired from singing in those costumes?" Freddie didn't flinch. He simply looked at the angry young man in front of him, all bravado and borrowed rage, and saw exactly what Sid was. A scared kid from a council estate playing dress-up in rebellion, desperate to matter, terrified he never would. And in that moment, Freddie Mercury decided to teach him something about real power. This is the story of the day punk rock met its match, not with violence or volume, but with something far more devastating: dignity. 1977 was a war for London's soul. On one side stood the establishment, the stadium-filling bands with their elaborate productions, their technical mastery, their multi-album contracts and growing wealth. They represented everything the establishment loved: success, professionalism, the dream that talent and hard work could transform you from nothing into something extraordinary. On the other side surged punk rock, raw, angry, deliberately ugly, spitting contempt at anything that smelled of pretension or polish. Punk was the voice of kids from council estates, from broken homes, from futures that looked like concrete walls with no doors. It wasn't about talent, it was about truth. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. Queen occupied a complicated position in this cultural battlefield. They'd started as outsiders themselves, 4 university students with impossible dreams, playing small clubs to audiences that sometimes numbered in single digits. They'd built their empire through relentless work, through refusing to accept that their ambitions were too large, through perfecting their craft until no one could deny their excellence. But by 1977, they were undeniably establishment. Stadium headliners, platinum albums, elaborate stage shows that cost more than most punk bands would earn in their entire careers. To the punks, Queen represented everything that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. And Freddie Mercury, flamboyant, theatrical, unapologetically excessive, was the perfect target. Wessex Studios on Highbury New Park in North London was legendary in the music world. Located in a converted church, it had hosted everyone from the Rolling Stones to Led Zeppelin. The building itself was beautiful high ceilings, excellent acoustics, an atmosphere that encouraged creativity. In the spring of 1977, 2 very different versions of British music were recording under the same roof. Queen was working on News of the World, the album that would give the world "We Will Rock You" and "We Are the Champions." They approached recording with the seriousness of architects designing cathedrals, every note considered, every harmony perfected, every decision made in service of creating something that would last. The Sex Pistols, meanwhile, were recording "Never Mind the Bollocks." Their approach was the opposite: raw, immediate, capturing energy over perfection, caring more about attitude than technique. The studios were separated by a corridor and a worldview. Freddie Mercury sat at the grand piano in Studio A, his fingers moving across the keys with the precision that came from years of classical training. He was 30 years old, though he looked younger, his trademark, thick, dark mustache, framing a face that showed both the confidence of success and the exhaustion of perfectionism. He wore simple clothes for the studio session: a white button-down shirt, dark pants, minimal jewelry compared to his stage persona. His short dark hair was style but not elaborate. This was working Freddie, not performing Freddie, though the two were never entirely separate. Brian May sat nearby with his homemade red special guitar, his signature white curly hair catching the studio lights. Roger Taylor was at the drums, blonde and focused. John Deacon stood with his bass, quiet as always, the steady foundation upon which everything else was built. They were working on a particularly difficult passage, searching for the perfect arrangement, when the studio door burst open without warning. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the harsh quarter fluorescence, was Sid Vicious. Born John Simon Ritchie, though some called him Simon John, and his family had sometimes used the name Stanley, the 20-year-old bassist of the Sex Pistols was the physical embodiment of punk's aesthetic safety pins through his clothes and occasionally his skin. A dirty leather jacket covered in provocative slogans, torn jeans, combat boots, and a sneer that suggested he'd rather spit on you than speak to you. He wasn't particularly talented as a musician, even other punks acknowledged that. What he had was attitude, a willingness to be shocking, and the kind of nihilistic energy that made great copy for music journalists looking for controversy. He walked into Queen's studio like he owned it, his boots heavy on the floor, and headed straight for the piano where Freddie sat. "So you're the famous Freddie Mercury," Sid said, his voice cutting through the studio's noble silence like a knife through silk. His accent was pure working-class London, deliberately rougher than it might have been, weaponized as another form of authenticity. "Still doing those ballet dances, Fred? Or are you too tired from singing in those ridiculous costumes?" The studio went very still. Brian and Roger's eyes met across the room. John's grip tightened slightly on his bass. They'd seen Freddie handle hostile audiences, aggressive journalists, and homophobic hecklers. But this was different. This was someone invading their workspace, their creative sanctuary. Freddie slowly removed his hands from the piano keys. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. He simply breathed one deep, controlled breath that seemed to expand his entire presence. Then he leaned back in the piano bench, looking up at Sid with an expression that wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was something closer to pity, mixed with amusement, the way you might look at a child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. "You know, darling," Freddie said, his voice carrying that distinctive crystal clarity that could fill stadiums without amplification, "ballet requires extraordinary discipline, but I doubt someone like you understands what the word discipline even means." Sid leaned against the piano, deliberately invading Freddie's space, getting in his face the way he'd probably intimidated countless people before. "People are screaming in the streets," Sid snarled, close enough that Freddie could smell the cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. "We're changing everything. And you're sitting here arranging notes like a princess. Who gives a fuck about your artistic depth?" It was meant to wound, meant to make Freddie defensive, angry, to prove that the establishment rock star was just as fragile as punk claimed. Instead, Freddie slowly stood up. He was shorter than Sid. Freddie stood about 5 feet 9 inches, while Sid was taller and lankier, but somehow in that moment he seemed to fill the entire room. His presence expanded to dwarf the young punk's borrowed aggression. Freddie reached out with one finger and touched one of the safety pins on Sid's jacket collar. The gesture was almost tender, but his eyes, his dark, intelligent eyes, that had seen poverty in Zanzibar, revolution, immigration, discrimination, the long climb from nothing to everything, locked onto Sid's with an intensity that made the younger man falter. "Look at me, Stanley," Freddie said quietly. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sid's sneer froze on his face. Nobody called him Stanley. That was a family name, a childhood name, a name from before he'd reinvented himself as Sid Vicious. It was the name of a scared kid from a council estate, not a punk rock icon. "My name is Sid," the young man growled, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. His authority was cracking. "No," Freddie said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even more authoritative. "Your name is Stanley, or Simon, or John, depending on which version of yourself you're pretending to be today." He paused, letting that sink in, letting Sid understand that Freddie saw through every layer of punk posturing into the frightened, angry boy underneath. "Have you ever actually looked at yourself?" Freddie continued, his tone shifting from confrontational to something almost educational, like a teacher addressing a particularly difficult student. "Do you really think you're changing the world just by making noise? Let me explain something to your little punk rock brain. It takes just one stone to break a window, but it takes a lifetime to turn that glass into a work of art." Freddie's hand moved from the safety pin to Sid's jacket collar, gripping it firmly. "You're just screaming, Stanley. I'm writing history." Sid opened his mouth to respond, probably with another prepared insult. Another borrowed line of punk rhetoric, but Freddie didn't give him the chance. With a movement that was both firm and strangely dignified, Freddie began physically steering Sid toward the door. Not violently, not roughly, but with the kind of unshakable certainty that made resistance seem pointless. "This is a temple, Stanley," Freddie said as he guided the stumbling punk toward the exit. "This is a place where people work, where craftsmen perfect their art, not where children come to throw tantrums because they're angry at their fathers and don't know how to channel it into anything meaningful." They reached the doorway. Freddie released Sid's collar but blocked his path back into the studio. "Now take those ridiculous boots and get away from my door. Go play outside. Continue your little revolution. But don't waste my time." Sid stumbled backward into the corridor, his face flushed, whether with rage or embarrassment. It was hard to tell. His carefully constructed punk persona had been dismantled in less than 3 minutes by a man in a simple white shirt who hadn't raised his voice once. "You can't throw me out!" Sid shouted from the corridor, his voice cracking slightly with emotion that undermined his attempted authority. "This is a free studio." Freddie's hand rested on the door handle. A slight, knowing smile played across his face, not cruel, not mocking, but carrying the weight of someone who'd learned hard lessons that this angry child hadn't even imagined yet. "Freedom, darling," Freddie said, his voice carrying down the corridor with perfect clarity, "is knowing what to do with your choices. You don't even know what you're fighting for, only what you're fighting against. That's not rebellion. That's just noise." He paused, letting that sink in. "Go away and try to learn some actual music. Maybe someday you'll have a soul noble enough to appreciate ballet. Or at the very least, you'll learn the difference between breaking things and building something worth keeping." The door closed with a soft click. Not a slam, not a bang, just a quiet, definitive closure that was somehow more final than any dramatic gesture could have been. Sid stood in the corridor for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his chest heaving with emotions he couldn't quite name. Behind him, members of the Sex Pistols crew who'd witnessed the exchange tried very hard not to laugh. Inside Studio A, absolute silence reigned for perhaps 5 seconds. Then Freddie turned back to the piano, settled onto the bench with perfect composure, placed his hands on the keys, and looked at Brian with a gentle smile. "Where were we, darling? I believe this section needs a more noble sound, don't you think?" Brian's expression was pure admiration mixed with barely suppressed amusement. "That was magnificent, Fred." "That was necessary," Freddie corrected, beginning to play. "Talent without discipline is just noise." He needed to learn that from someone. "Now, shall we actually make some music?" The incident became legendary almost immediately. The story spread through London's music scene within days, embellished, exaggerated, mythologized, but fundamentally true in its essence. Freddie Mercury had faced down Sid Vicious without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, without descending to the level of physical confrontation that punk valued. He'd done it with words, with presence, with the quiet authority that comes from actually knowing who you are rather than performing who you think you should be. For Queen, it became another piece of their mythology, the moment when their frontman proved that dignity could be more powerful than aggression. That real strength wasn't about who could scream the loudest, but who could remain calm when everyone else was losing control. For Sid Vicious, the encounter was more complicated. Some reports suggest he was deeply affected by it, that being called Stanley and having his punk persona so thoroughly dismantled shook something in him. Others say he brushed it off, claimed it never happened or didn't matter. But people who knew him noticed something after that day. A certain hesitancy when Queen's name came up in conversation. A reluctance to mock them with quite the same confidence he'd had before. Because it's one thing to rebel against authority that responds with anger or dismissal. It's quite another to rebel against someone who looks at you with something closer to pity, who sees through your armor to the frightened child underneath and names it out loud. The broader significance of the encounter transcended the two individuals involved. In 1977, the cultural battle between punk and progressive rock felt existential. Punks genuinely believed they were tearing down a corrupt establishment to build something more authentic. Established bands felt they were defending artistic excellence against nihilistic vandalism. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. Punk's anger was legitimate, the frustration of working-class kids with no economic futures, no political power, no voice in a system that seemed designed to keep them in their place. Their rage was real, even if their solutions were often destructive. But Queen's journey was also legitimate. Four outsiders who'd built something extraordinary through talent and relentless work, who'd refused to accept that their ambitions were too large, who'd proven that excellence wasn't elitist but achievable. The Wessex Studios confrontation crystallized these tensions in a single moment. What happens when someone who's actually earned their authority meets someone whose entire identity is built on rejecting all authority? Freddie's response was instructive. He didn't argue about the legitimacy of Punk's grievances. He didn't defend his wealth or success. He didn't try to prove he was still working class at heart. He simply refused to accept that destruction was equivalent to creation. He insisted that making noise wasn't the same as making music. He demanded that respect be earned through craft, not claimed through volume. And he did it all while calling a famous punk by his childhood name, reducing him from Sid Vicious to Stanley, from icon back to scared kid. Sid Vicious would be dead within 2 years, dying at 21 from a heroin overdose, while out on bail for allegedly murdering his girlfriend. His life was brief, chaotic, and tragic, a cautionary tale about the difference between performing rebellion and actually understanding what you're rebelling against. Freddie Mercury would live until 1991, creating music that would outlive both him and the punk movement, proving that craft and discipline and, yes, even theatrical excess could produce art that genuinely mattered to millions. The lesson of Wessex Studios wasn't that punk was wrong and Queen was right. It was something more subtle. Real power doesn't come from breaking things or from protecting things, but from knowing the difference between the two. It comes from building something worth keeping while remaining open to legitimate criticism. It comes from defending your values without needing to destroy everyone who disagrees. Freddie Mercury understood this in a way that Sid Vicious never would. He'd been an outsider his entire life, an immigrant, a Parsi in a Christian country, a queer man in a heteronormative industry, someone whose voice and theatrical instincts marked him as different from the moment he opened his mouth. He'd faced real discrimination, real barriers, real struggles that made punks performed rebellion look like children playing dress-up. And he'd won not by getting angrier or louder, but by becoming undeniable, by being so talented, so distinctive, so absolutely himself that people had no choice but to accept him on his terms. That day at Wessex Studios, when Freddie closed the door on Sid Vicious with a quiet click, instead of a satisfying slam, he was demonstrating a truth that punk would take years to understand. The most powerful response to disrespect isn't fury, it's dismissal. It's looking at someone's attempt to wound you and finding it irrelevant. Özgürlük, ne yapacağını bilmektir canım, Freddie had said. Freedom is knowing what to do. Sid was free to be angry, free to reject authority, free to make noise and call it revolution. But Freddie was free in a way that Sid couldn't comprehend, free from needing anyone's approval, free from needing to prove his worth through volume, free to create exactly what he wanted and let the world catch up. That's the freedom that comes from discipline, from craft, from knowing who you are so completely that other people's opinions become background noise. When Freddie returned to his piano and asked where they were in the arrangement, when he suggested the section needed a more noble sound, he was making a final statement. Real nobility isn't about titles or class or who can be more shocking. It's about dedication to something larger than yourself. It's about respecting your craft enough to perfect it rather than just performing it. Punk rock tried to kill Queen that year. It failed, not because Queen fought back with aggression or because they compromised their vision to seem more punk. They succeeded because they understood something fundamental. You can't destroy something by hating it. You can only destroy it by building something better. Punk built anger and energy and important cultural criticism, but it didn't build cathedrals. It didn't build Bohemian Rhapsody or Somebody to Love or songs that would still move people to tears 40 years later. Queen built those. Freddie built those. And on that spring day in 1977, in a converted church in North London, He taught an angry young man named Stanley that breaking windows is easy. Creating stained glass takes a lifetime. The door clicked back shut. The piano began to play. And somewhere in the corridor, a punk rocker realized he'd just been dismissed by someone who'd fought harder battles than he could imagine. Real power, it turned out, wasn't in the scream. It was in the silence that followed.